Standoff is coming to a head today. The final debate before the first vote is happening tonight. CNN's Mani Raju is on Capitol Hill. CNN's Jeremy Diamond is at the White House. Let's start with Jeremy. So what are you learning about the legal strategy that the president's coming up with?
Well, look, Kate, the president's legal team has been preparing for weeks for this moment, for the House to send over those articles of impeachment and for that Senate trial to begin soon thereafter. We know that, of course, that the president has been frustrated by that delay because, of course, he is hoping for a vindication in this Senate trial, hoping that Senate Republicans stick together and provide him that vindication that he has been seeking.
In this speculative analysis of a potential future political scenario,
means. Okay, so the entire American judicial system just went into absolute meltdown mode. And what we're seeing right now is something that has never happened in the history of the United States. 27 federal judges coming from different circuits, which means different political backgrounds, different presidencies that appointed them, which means have just come together in an unprecedented coordinated action demanding immediate accountability for what they're calling a systematic assault on the rule of law. As this isn't some partisan grandstanding. This isn't a single judge making headlines. This is 27 members of the federal judiciary, which means people who spent their entire careers staying out of politics, who are now saying that the situation has become so dangerous, so fundamentally threatening to the constitutional order, means that they can no longer remain silent. And the implications of what just happened are absolutely massive. We're talking about a crisis that goes far beyond normal political disagreements, far beyond the usual back and forth between branches of government. This is the judiciary, the third branch of government, essentially declaring that the executive branch crossed a line that threads the entire system of checks and balances that has held this country together for nearly 250 years, which means. But here's the thing, you can't really trust mainstream media anymore to give you the full picture of what's actually happening here. They'll focus on the spectacle, the drama, which means the political horse race, but they won't tell you about the constitutional crisis that's brewing beneath the surface, and they won't explain why this moment could fundamentally reshape American democracy for generations to come. That's why we built this channel, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines and understand what's really at stake when judges are literally breaking with centuries of tradition to sound the alarm, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day with the kind of analysis you won't find anywhere else. Just click the link in the description to join, which means. And if you just want to support what we're doing, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth, because right now the truth is under assault like never before. All right, let's get back to the video. Here's what happened. In a joint statement released early this morning, 27 federal judges from 9 different circuit courts issued what they're calling a forming judicial petition, demanding that Congress immediately initiate impeachment proceedings against President Trump. The statement, which runs to 43 pages and includes detailed legal citations and evidence, lays out what these judges describe as a pattern of conduct that rises to the level of high crimes and misdemeanors under the Constitution. The judges involved include appointees from Republican and Democratic president alike, ranging from Reagan-era judges to Obama and Trump appointees, which tells you just serious this situation has become when judges appointed by Trump himself are now calling for his removal from office. The petition specifically cites what it describes as repeated and willful violations of court orders, attempts to intimidate and threaten members of the federal judiciary, systematic efforts to undermine judicial independence, and what the judges call an ongoing campaign to delegitimize the rule of law itself. The timing of this is absolutely critical. This comes just days after Trump publicly attacked multiple federal judges by name on social media, after the White House announced it would refuse to comply with several court orders related to immigration enforcement and federal funding, and after reports emerged that the administration has been privately discussing ways to remove judges who rule against the president. One judge involved in the petition, speaking anonymously to maintain the integrity of ongoing cases, told reporters that the situation has reached a point where members of the federal judiciary genuinely fear their safety and for the independence of the courts, another judge said that what we're witnessing is not normal political conflict between branches of government, but rather a systematic attempt to transform the judiciary from an independent check on executive power into what they called a rubber stamp for presidential authority. And this is where things start to unravel in ways that most people don't fully understand yet. The petition includes specific examples of conduct that the judges say cross the constitutional line. It documents at least 15 separate instances where the White House has refused to comply with court orders, including cases involving national security, immigration, means environmental protection, and civil rights. It details multiple occasions where Trump has publicly attacked judges hearing cases involving his administration, which means not just criticizing their decisions, which presidents have always done, but questioning their legitimacy, their loyalty, even their right to rule on cases involving the executive branch, which means the petition includes evidence that the administration has discussed using emergency powers to override court decisions, which means that White House officials have privately threatened to ignore Supreme Court rulings they disagree with, which means, and that there have been conversations about potentially removing federal judges through administrative means rather than the constitutionally prescribed impeachment process. But it gets worse. According to the petition, multiple judges have received what they describe as credible threats following presidential criticism, which means federal marshals have had to increase security at several courthouses. Some judges report that they're being followed, that their families are being harassed online, which means, and that the threats have become specific enough that the FBI has opened investigations. And while there's no evidence that these threats are directly coordinated by the White House, which means the judges point out that they invariably follow presidential attacks on specific judges by name, which means creating what they call a climate of intimidation that makes it impossible for the judiciary to function independently. One section of the petition describes how judges in immigration cases have been targeted with particularly vicious harassment campaigns after Trump criticized their rulings, which means with some receiving hundreds of threatening messages within hours of being named by the president. Now, the White House response has been exactly what you'd expect and exactly what makes this situation so dangerous. Within hours of the petition being released, Trump posted on social media calling the judges involved radical activists, deep state operatives, and enemies of the people. He claimed that the petition itself is proof that the judiciary has been weaponized against him, which means, and he suggested that Congress should investigate the judges for what he called a coordinated political attack on the presidency. Means press secretary appeared before cameras to denounce what she described as an unprecedented assault on executive authority, which means claiming that these judges are attempting to overturn the results of a democratic election and impose their own political preferences on the American people, which means, and here's what's absolutely chilling about this response: nowhere, not once, did anyone from the White House address the specific allegations in the petition. The documented instances of non-compliance with court orders, the threats against judicial independence, the refusal to accept the legitimacy of judicial review itself. Instead, which means the administration has gone on the attack, and in doing so, has essentially confirmed what the judges are saying, which means, because what we're seeing here is a fundamental rejection of the entire concept of checks and balances, which means the position being articulated by this White House is not that they disagree with certain court decisions, not that they think judges have overstepped in specific cases, which means, but that the judiciary itself has no right to limit presidential authority, which means that court orders are merely suggestions that the president can ignore if he deems them politically motivated, and that any judge who rules against the administration is by definition engaged in a political attack rather than exercising constitutional authority. This is not how the American system is supposed to work. This is not a matter of political disagreement. This is a direct challenge to the constitutional order itself. Let's understand what this petition is actually asking for, because it's important to be precise about this. The judges are not asking Congress to automatically impeach the president, which means they're asking Congress to fulfill its constitutional duty by investigating whether the president's conduct rises to the level of impeachability. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, which means the House of Representatives has the sole power of impeachment, meaning they decide whether to bring charges, and the Senate has the sole power to try impeachments, which meaning they decide whether to convict and remove from office. What these judges are saying is that based on what they have witnessed in their courtrooms, which means based on the documented pattern of behavior they've laid out in 43 pages of legal analysis, means Congress to seriously examine whether the president has committed high crimes and misdemeanors. They're essentially acting as witnesses, which means people with direct knowledge of what's happening to the judicial branch who are coming forward to tell the legislative branch that there's a constitutional crisis in progress, which means, and here's the problem that makes this different from the previous impeachment proceedings. In the first impeachment, the focus was on abuse of power related to Ukraine and obstruction of Congress. In the second impeachment, it was incitement of insurrection related to January 6th, which means both of those were serious, both resulted in impeachment by the House, but neither resulted in conviction by the Senate, and both could be dismissed by Trump's supporters as partisan political attacks. But this is different. This is the judiciary itself, the one branch that's supposed to be above politics, saying that the president is systematically attacking the foundations of constitutional government. These are not politicians, which means they're not partisan operatives. These are federal judges, people who took an oath to uphold the Constitution, who have lifetime appointments specifically so they won't be influenced by political pressure, which means who are now saying that the situation has become so serious that they have to break with tradition and speak out publicly. The legal framework here is critical to understand. Impeachment is not a criminal process. You don't have to commit a crime in the traditional sense to be impeached and removed from office, which means the Constitution says that presidents can be impeached for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, and that phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, which means, has been understood since the founding to mean serious abuses of power that threaten the constitutional system, even if they don't violate a specific criminal statute, which means the Federalist Papers make it clear that impeachment was designed to address what Hamilton called injuries done immediately to the society itself, offenses that arise from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. And what these judges are documenting is exactly that. A systematic abuse of executive power designed to undermine one of the fundamental pillars of American democracy, the independence of the judiciary. Historical context matters here, which means we have had presidents who disagreed with court decisions. Thomas Jefferson was furious with John Marshall's Supreme Court, which means Andrew Jackson reportedly said that Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it, though that quote is disputed. FDR tried to pack the Supreme Court when it kept striking down New Deal legislation. Richard Nixon had to be forced by the Supreme Court to turn over the Watergate tapes. But even in the worst of these conflicts, even when presidents pushed back hard against judicial authority, there was always an ultimate acceptance that court orders were binding, that judges had the constitutional authority to check executive power, that the rule of law meant something. What's happening now is different, which means what these judges are describing is not a president who's angry about losing in court and trying to find ways around unfavorable decisions. It's a president who is denying the legitimacy of judicial review itself, who is arguing that he has the authority to simply ignore court orders he disagrees with, which means, and who is actively working to intimidate judges who might rule against him in the future. Okay, let's break down what this actually means, because the implications are staggering on multiple levels. First, understand that this is a constitutional crisis in the most literal sense. The Constitution created three co-equal branches of government as a system of checks and balances. The executive branch enforces the law, the legislative branch makes the law, which means, and the judicial branch interprets the law and ensures that both other branches stay within constitutional limits, which means this system only works if all three branches accept their respective roles and respect the authority of the others, which means when the executive branch decides it can simply ignore the judicial branch, the entire system breaks down. Because if the president can ignore court orders, then there is no check on executive power. If judges can't enforce their rulings, then constitutional rights become meaningless. It means if the rule of law is whatever the president says it is, then we no longer have a constitutional republic, which means we have something much closer to an authoritarian system where power is concentrated in a single individual who is not bound by legal constraints. Second, this completely reshapes the political landscape heading into the 2026 midterms and beyond. Democrats now have something they've been struggling to articulate effectively, which means a clear, legally grounded case that Trump is not just a president they disagree with politically, which means, but an active threat to constitutional government endorsed by members of the judiciary itself, which means every single congressional candidate is going to be asked where they stand on this judicial petition, which means, do you believe federal judges when they say the president is attacking the independence of the courts? Do you think Congress should investigate these allegations? Are you comfortable with a president who refuses to comply with court orders? And Republicans are going to be put in an impossible position if they defend Trump, which means they're essentially arguing that presidents should be able to ignore the judiciary, which creates a precedent that could be used by any future president of any party. It means if they break with Trump, they face a primary challenge from MAGA supporters who will call them traitors. And if they try to straddle the middle by saying they need more information or the allegations need to be investigated, they look weak and indecisive. Third, means This has massive implications for institutional legitimacy and public trust in government. One of the most dangerous aspects of the current political environment is the erosion of shared belief in democratic institutions. When different parts of the population can't even agree on basic facts, means when one side views FBI as a deep state conspiracy and the other side views it as an essential law enforcement agency. Which when some people think courts are legitimate arbiters of constitutional questions and others think they're just political actors in robes, which means the foundations of democratic governance start to crumble. And what Trump has done, what he's been doing systematically since long before he became president, is attack the legitimacy of any institution that constrains his power. The press is fake news. The intelligence agencies are the deep state. Elections he loses are rigged. And now, means courts that rule against him are radical activists engaged in political persecution. This judicial petition is an attempt by one of those institutions to push back, to say clearly and publicly that these attacks are not legitimate criticism, they're an assault on the constitutional order itself. But the question is whether it will matter, which means will the American people, or at least enough of the American people, believe federal judges when they say there's a crisis? Or will this just become another front in an endless partisan war where everyone picks the institutional authorities they want to believe and dismisses the others as politically motivated? Fourth, there are serious international implications that cannot be ignored. America's power and influence in the world rest partly on military and economic strength, which means, but also substantially on the perception that we are a stable democracy governed by the rule of law. When foreign investors decide where to put their money, means when foreign governments decide whether to align with the United States or hedge their bets by building relationships with China or other powers. When international institutions decide whether to follow American leadership on global issues, which means they're making calculations based in part on whether the United States is a reliable partner with predictable, law-based governance. A constitutional crisis where the president is openly defying the judiciary and federal judges are petitioning Congress for impeachment does not inspire confidence. Our allies in Europe and Asia are watching this and wondering whether American democracy is stable enough to be counted on. Our adversaries are watching this and seeing weakness, division, and dysfunction they can exploit. Markets hate uncertainty, which means, and what could be more uncertain than a situation where the president might simply decide not to follow court orders? Fifth, which think about what this means for every other legal case involving Trump or his administration. There are currently hundreds of ongoing cases in federal courts dealing with everything from immigration policy to environmental regulations to tax disputes to investigations into potential criminal conduct. Every single one of those cases now takes place in a context where the judiciary itself has said the president is systematically attacking judicial independence. Which how does a judge rule in a case involving the administration when there's a documented pattern of the White House refusing to comply with unfavorable orders? How does the Justice Department argue cases in federal court when the judges hearing those cases have colleagues who just petitioned Congress to impeach the president the Attorney General serves? How do you maintain any pretense of normal legal process when the executive branch has made it clear they view the judicial branch as a political enemy rather than a co-equal branch of government? Sixth, and this is something people are not talking about enough, this creates a direct confrontation between federal judges and the president that has to be resolved one way or another. Either Congress investigates and potentially impeaches, means which would vindicate the judges and reaffirm the principle that presidents are bound by the rule of law, or Congress refuses to act, which would essentially give presidential approval to ignoring court orders and attacking judicial independence, and would tell every future president that this behavior is acceptable, which means, or we end up in some kind of extended constitutional standoff where different parts of the government are claiming authority and no one quite knows who has the final say, means, which is probably the worst outcome because it means the Constitution itself has become contested ground rather than a shared framework for resolving disputes. Status quo is not stable. You cannot have a functioning constitutional system where federal judges are publicly saying the president is attacking the rule of law and nothing happens. Something has to give, which means, seventh, consider what this means for the Supreme Court, which has so far managed to stay mostly above the fray, which means the 9 justices are undoubtedly watching this situation very carefully, and they have to be thinking about their own institutional position, which means if lower court judges are being attacked and threatened, if court orders are being ignored, if the president is questioning the legitimacy of judicial review itself, then the Supreme Court cannot assume it's immune. At some point, probably soon, there will be a case where the Supreme Court issues a ruling Trump really doesn't like, which means, and the question will be whether he complies. And if he doesn't, then what? The court has no army. It has no police force, which means its power rests entirely on the acceptance of its authority by the other branches and by the American people. John Marshall established the principle of judicial review in Marbury v. Madison, but that principle only works if everyone agrees to follow it. The Supreme Court can rule however it wants. But if the president says no and Congress doesn't impeach him for defying the court, then judicial review becomes a dead letter, which means, and with it goes one of the fundamental principles of American constitutional democracy. Eighth, there's a very real question about what happens to the judges who signed this petition. They're supposed to have lifetime appointments and be immune from political pressure, but they've just made themselves targets in an incredibly high-stakes political fight, which means Trump has already attacked them on social media. His supporters are going to go after them relentlessly. There will probably be calls in Congress for investigating the judges, which means, or even for impeaching them, which would be a stunning reversal where the judges asking for presidential impeachment end up facing impeachment themselves. And while judges are supposed to be insulated from this kind of pressure, they're still human beings with families and lives outside the courtroom, which means, and the level of vitriol and potential danger they're about to face is unprecedented. This took real courage. Means these judges knew exactly what they were doing and what the consequences would be. Means, and they did it anyway because they believed the threat to the constitutional order was serious enough to warrant breaking with centuries of judicial tradition that says judges should stay out of politics. Means. Now here's where this becomes a lot bigger than it looks on the surface. This is not just about Trump, which means this is about whether the American system of constitutional government can survive in an era of deep polarization and institutional distrust, which because the precedents being set right now will outlast any individual president. If Trump can refuse to comply with court orders and face no meaningful consequences, which means then the next president can do it too, and the one after that, which means, and eventually the idea that presidents are constrained by law becomes a quaint historical relic rather than a living reality. If federal judges can be attacked and intimidated for ruling against the executive branch, then judicial independence dies, which means, and with it goes the ability of courts to protect individual rights against government overreach, which means, if Congress refuses to act when presented with documented evidence of serious constitutional violations because doing so would be politically costly, then the impeachment power becomes useless as a check on presidential abuse of power. The historical parallel that keeps coming up in legal circles is to the Saturday Night Massacre. Means when Nixon ordered his attorney general to fire the special prosecutor investigating Watergate, and the AG refused and resigned rather than carry out an unlawful order. And then the deputy attorney general also refused and resigned. And finally, the solicitor general fired the special prosecutor, but the whole abusode was such a clear abuse of power that it accelerated the impeachment process and ultimately led to Nixon's resignation, which means, but there's a key difference. In that case, you had people inside the executive branch itself refusing to carry out what they saw as unlawful orders, which means, and you had a Congress that was willing to stand up to the president regardless of party affiliation. Do we have that now? Are there enough people in positions of authority who will put constitutional principles ahead of partisan loyalty? That's the question this judicial petition is forcing. And the answer will determine whether American democracy can course correct or whether we're watching the beginning of a fundamental transformation into something much less democratic. Means people inside the judiciary are saying, and this is on background because they can't speak publicly while this is pending, but the decision to issue this petition was not made lightly. There were months of private discussions, which means debates about whether this crossed the line from judicial independence into political activism, which means concerns about whether it would make the situation worse by further politicizing the courts, arguments about whether judges should ever take this kind of public stand or whether they should simply continue doing their jobs and trusting that the other branches would fulfill their constitutional responsibilities, which means what ultimately pushed them to go public was a combination of factors: the escalating nature of the attacks, the documented pattern of non-compliance with court orders, which means the threats against individual judges, and the growing sense that if the judiciary didn't speak up clearly and collectively, means then the systematic dismantling of judicial independence would continue unchecked. As one judge reportedly said in these private discussions, which means we took an oath to defend the Constitution, not to remain silent while it's being undermined. The congressional response is going to be absolutely critical, which means, and right now it's completely uncertain. The House is controlled by Republicans with a narrow majority, which means, and the votes for impeachment are simply not there unless something dramatic changes, which means even Republicans who are privately disturbed by Trump's attacks on the judiciary are terrified of facing a primary challenge from the right, and the MAGA base views any criticism of Trump as betrayal. The Senate is also Republican-controlled, and conviction would require a two-thirds vote, means which you'd need significant numbers of Republicans to vote to remove a Republican president, which seems nearly impossible in the current political environment. But the fact that it seems impossible is its sign of how broken things have become, because the question members of Congress are supposed to ask is not what's politically safe, but whether the president has violated his oath of office in ways that warrant removal. That's what impeachment is for. It's not a political tool for the opposition party, which means a constitutional safeguard for when the executive branch poses a threat to the republic itself. What happens in the next few weeks is going to tell us a lot about where this country is headed. If Congress takes this petition seriously, holds hearings, examines the evidence, which means, and has a genuine debate about whether presidential defiance of court orders and attacks on judicial independence constitute impeachable offenses, then at least the system is working as designed, even if it's strained. If Congress immediately dismisses this as a partisan attack without seriously engaging with the allegations, then it means one branch of government is abandoning its responsibility to check the others, and the balance of powers is already gone. Which means, and if we end up in some kind of middle ground where there are hearings, but they're obviously just political theater and nothing substantive happens, which means then we're watching the slow death of constitutional accountability, where the forms are maintained but the substance has been hollowed out. International observers, people who study democratic backsliding and authoritarian consolidation around the world, are watching what's happening in the United States with a mixture of fascination and horror. Because this is how democracies die, not usually through military coups or sudden dramatic collapses, but through the gradual erosion of institutional checks and balances, means the normalization of behavior that would have been unthinkable a few years earlier, the increasing partisanship of institutions that are supposed to be neutral, which means, and the transformation of constitutional principles into political weapons. When courts become just another partisan battlefield, when impeachment becomes impossible because party loyalty trumps constitutional duty, when presidents can ignore legal constraints without consequence, which means you still have elections and you still have the formal structures of democracy, but the substance of democratic governance means the idea that power is constrained by law and that rights are protected even against majoritarian pressure, that substance starts to disappear. So here's the bottom line, which means 27 federal judges have just done something unprecedented in American history. They have publicly called for the impeachment of a sitting president, not because of a specific criminal act or a single abuse of power, which means, but because they have witnessed firsthand a systematic campaign to undermine judicial independence and the rule of law itself. They have documented this pattern in a 43-page petition with legal citations and specific examples. They have put their own careers and safety at risk by taking this public stand. And now the question is whether it will matter. It means, will Congress fulfill its constitutional duty to investigate these allegations seriously? Will the American people understand what's at stake when the judiciary itself says there's a constitutional crisis? Will institutions hold? Or will we continue the slide toward a system where presidential power is effectively unconstrained by law? This is not a drill. This is not political theater. This is not the usual partisan back and forth that characterizes American politics. This is the judicial branch of the United States government formally declaring that the executive branch has constitutional lines that threaten the entire system of checks and balances. The judges involved knew exactly what they were doing and how it would be received. They did it anyway because they believed the alternative, staying silent while the rule of law is systematically dismantled, is worse. History is going to judge what happens next. And all of us who are alive right now are going to have to live with the consequences. Keep your eyes on Congress over the next few weeks. Watch how individual members respond to this petition, not just what they say publicly, but whether they're willing to actually investigate the allegations seriously. Watch how the White House responds as this unfolds, means whether the attacks escalate or whether there's any recognition that federal judges speaking with one voice carries weight that cannot simply be dismissed. Which means watch how the Supreme Court navigates this crisis, whether they stay silent or whether at some point they feel compelled to wade in on the constitutional questions at stake. Which means, and watch how the American people respond, whether this breaks through the partisan noise and creates genuine public pressure for accountability, or whether it just becomes another piece of content in the endless stream of political conflict that everyone has learned to tune out. This story is far from over. In fact, it's really just beginning, because what we're watching unfold right could define the next decade of American politics and determine whether constitutional democracy in the United States survives this period of extreme polarization and institutional stress. It means the judges have spoken. They've issued their warning. They've documented their case. Now we'll see whether anyone is listening and whether it matters.